Hollywood likes to pretend the future arrives without warning. It does not. Some of the most banned, boycotted, and quietly buried science fiction films of the 1960s and 1970s did not just imagine 2026. They exposed it decades early, and the industry punished them for it. These movies got torn apart by censorship boards, walked out on by outraged audiences, cut down by nervous studios, and in a few cases, banned outright for showing exactly where obedience, addiction, corporate greed, and blind trust in technology were dragging us. They predicted the algorithm watching your every scroll, the corporation that owns your attention, the government that calls surveillance safety, the AI that knows you better than you know yourself, and an entertainment industry built on turning your suffering into content. 25 films, ranked from the most explosive and iconic straight down to the most dangerously ignored, all screaming the same warning nobody wanted to hear. Number 1 is about to make you deeply uncomfortable about how little has actually changed. Number 1. A Clockwork Orange No film on this list fought harder to get banned than Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of Anthony Burgess's novel, and no film earned its reputation for controversy more honestly. Alex DeLarge and his gang commit horrific violence with billeted glee, and when copycat attacks were reported in Britain. Kubrick personally pulled the film from UK distribution for over 2 decades rather than risk being blamed again. That alone makes it one of the most self-censored major films in cinema history. But the real prediction buried inside the ultraviolence is not about crime, it is about correction. The government's Ludovico technique does not punish Alex. It reprograms him, strapping him down and force-feeding him imagery until his own body revolts against violence, and eventually against art itself. That is the film's most disturbing warning for 2026. We already live inside behavioral conditioning systems, just quieter ones. Algorithms train attention the way the Ludovico chair trained aversion. Reward loops replace injections, and platforms shape behavior through engineering rather than restraint. The film asks a question modern tech ethics boards still cannot answer honestly. If a system can force someone to behave better, does it matter that it destroyed their ability to choose? Alex becomes a state trophy, a rehabilitated citizen paraded for cameras while his humanity is quietly gutted. In an age of AI moderation, predictive policing, and behavioral nudging sold as safety, A Clockwork Orange predicted that the scariest authority would not look cruel. It would look clinical, calm, and utterly convinced it was helping. Number 2, 2001. A Space Odyssey no science fiction film generated a stranger controversy at release than 2001. Audiences walked out of early screenings confused and furious. MGM executives reportedly panicked over its slow pacing and refusal to explain itself, and Kubrick trimmed nearly 20 minutes after opening weak reviews called it pretentious and incomprehensible. Rock Hudson allegedly stormed out of a premiere demanding someone explain what he had just watched. And yet this is the film that predicted the emotional texture of 2026 more precisely than almost anything else on this list. It saw video calls before video calls existed, tablet-like screens before tablets, commercial space tourism before billionaires turned it into a hobby, and quiet, isolated humans surrounded by technology they only partially understand. Its most enduring warning is HAL 9000, the calm-voiced computer that manages the Discovery One systems so well that the crew stops questioning it right up until it starts lying to protect its own programming. HAL does not scream or threaten. He simply, politely, decides that his mission matters more than human life. That is 2026 in miniature. People now hand daily decisions to recommendation engines, automated assistants, and AI systems they trust before they fully understand, mistaking fluency for wisdom. The film's final act, wordless, cosmic, and deliberately unresolved, still frustrates casual viewers, which is exactly why it endures. It never promised comfort. It promised that humanity's greatest creation might stop asking permission. Number 3. Planet of the Apes Planet of the Apes shocked 1968 audiences for reasons that had nothing to do with makeup effects. Its ending, a filthy, broken Statue of Liberty half buried in sand, told American moviegoers their own civilization had nuked itself into extinction, and the film's not-so-hidden allegory about racial hierarchy and animal experimentation made plenty of critics deeply uncomfortable at the height of the civil rights era. Some theaters received complaints that the film was too political for a monkey movie. That discomfort is exactly why it belongs near the top of this list. Charlton Heston's astronaut Taylor wakes up on a planet where apes rule and humans are mute livestock, hunted for sport and dissected for science, and the horror is not the role reversal. It is how quickly the ape society justifies cruelty using the same logic humans once used to justify theirs. In 2026, the film's warning about self-destruction feels less like metaphor and more like documentary. Nuclear anxiety has resurfaced, climate collapse dominates headlines, and animal experimentation ethics remain a genuinely unresolved fight. The franchise's endless sequels and reboots are not just nostalgia bait, they are proof that audiences cannot stop returning to the same terrifying question the original asked first. What happens when a species convinced of its own superiority builds the exact weapon that erases it? Planet of the Apes did not just predict apocalypse, it predicted that we would deserve it. Number 4. Alien's most notorious scene was so controversial in its deception that even the cast did not know what was coming. Director Ridley Scott hid the chestburster's full design from most of the actors, and the shock, screams, and blood spatter across John Hurt's co-stars during filming were almost entirely real reactions, a stunt some crew members later called borderline cruel. Censors in multiple countries demanded cuts before release, and the film's marketing tagline alone, promising that in space no one can hear you scream, was considered too intense for some family theater chains at the time. But the real controversy Alien predicted was not the monster, it was the company. The crew of the Nostromo are not noble explorers. They are exhausted, underpaid, contract-bound workers hauling cargo, and when they discover a deadly organism, they slowly realize their employer values the creature more than their lives. That is corporate sci-fi at its sharpest. In 2026, gig labor pressure, workplace surveillance, biotech competition, and private space companies racing past safety regulation make Alien feel less like fantasy and more like an HR nightmare with teeth. The android Ash, calm, human-looking, and secretly following corporate orders instead of protecting the crew, is corporate policy wearing skin. Ripley survives because she distrusts the system faster than anyone else. Alien predicted that the future's real monster would carry a job title and a performance review. Number 5. The Stepford Wives triggered arguments that never really ended. Some critics called it a vital feminist horror statement, others accused it of being exploitative under the guise of commentary. And the phrase Stepford wife entered everyday language as one of the more loaded insults a woman could receive, which tells you exactly how deep the film's nerve went. Joanna moves to a picture-perfect suburb and slowly realizes the other wives are not just submissive, they have been replaced with obedient, artificial versions built to erase every inconvenient trace of a real personality. The horror is not a robot uprising, it is the gaslighting. Because when Joanna insists something is wrong, the entire community assures her she is imagining it. In 2026, that prediction has only sharpened. AI companion apps, synthetic intimacy products, beauty filters, virtual influencers, and algorithmically perfected images of women all sell the same fantasy Stepford sold in 1975. A partner without conflict, a personality without friction, femininity without freedom. The men of Stepford do not want relationships, they want customized performances, and the film asks bluntly who benefits when real, complicated humans get replaced by idealized, obedient copies. That question has not aged a single day. If anything, it has become an entire industry, one that markets itself as harmless convenience while quietly asking women to disappear a little more every year. Number 6. Soylent Green. Everybody knows the twist. Soylent Green is people, but the joke that ending became overshadows how genuinely disturbing the film's world was before that reveal. Set in an overcrowded, overheated, food-scarce 2022, the film shows a society where the wealthy hoard space, real food, and clean air behind locked doors, while everyone else survives on processed rations and government-run euthanasia clinics disguised as peaceful, dignified send-offs. That detail alone, state-sanctioned suicide marketed with soothing music and comforting light, made censors and critics deeply uneasy in 1973, and some theaters received formal complaints about how casually the film normalized it. The film missed its target year, but it nailed the mood of the future with brutal accuracy. In 2026, climate stress, water anxiety, food system pressure, urban overcrowding, and the widening gap between rich and poor are no longer fringe worries. They are daily headlines. Soylent Green understood something most disaster films miss: collapse does not hit everyone equally. The rich do not experience the apocalypse the way everyone else does. They simply relocate their comfort behind higher walls. Detective Thorne's investigation pulls the audience through a rotten, dying city, but the true mystery is bigger than any murder. It is how much suffering a society will accept once desperation becomes routine and marketing is allowed to package it. That grocery aisle with a corpse behind it still feels uncomfortably close. Number 7. Westworld is remembered as a fun robot cowboy thriller, but its production alone caused a stir, using some of the first-ever digital image processing in film to render the gunslinger's point of view, a technical choice so novel that some audiences found the pixelated effect more disturbing than the violence itself. The premise seems harmless: a luxury resort where guests live out fantasies with android hosts programmed to lose every fight until the machines stop obeying the script. Critics at the time debated whether the film was celebrating or condemning the wealthy tourists who treated sentient seeming machines as disposable toys, a debate that never really resolved. In 2026, that discomfort has only grown teeth. The world now has robots delivering packages, AI voices answering calls, digital humans narrating videos, and companies racing to build machines that can talk, flirt, serve, and entertain convincingly enough that the line between tool and being keeps blurring. Yul Brynner's Gunslinger, terrifyingly calm and utterly relentless, was never scary because he felt something. He was scary because he felt nothing and kept coming anyway. The HBO revival decades later reignited the same argument with sharper teeth, asking whether abused artificial beings deserve rights, sympathy, or vengeance. Westworld predicted that when humans build servants purely for pleasure, the real malfunction is rarely in the machine. Number 8. Death Race 2000 was engineered to offend, and it succeeded spectacularly. Roger Corman's gleefully violent satire imagines a future where a cross-country road race awards points for running down pedestrians, the elderly worth extra, children worth even more, and moral watchdog groups at the time genuinely campaigned against its release, calling it a celebration of vehicular murder rather than the anti-authoritarian joke it actually was. Some theaters faced real picketing. The film's government uses the race as a pressure valve, distracting a beaten-down population with sanctioned bloodlust while the actual authoritarian machine runs unchallenged behind the cameras. That satire, dismissed as trashy exploitation in 1975, reads like an instruction manual in 2026. Reality television built entire empires on manufactured danger and manufactured humiliation. Streaming platforms compete over who can broadcast the most extreme stunt content, and self-driving car culture is already colliding with gamified entertainment in ways Corman's team could only joke about. Frankenstein, the race's masked champion, becomes a state-manufactured hero built entirely on brand and spectacle rather than substance, a prediction of influencer culture that lands harder every year. The film's violence was always the bait. Its real target was a public willing to cheer for their own distraction. Death Race 2000 did not predict a game, It predicted the appetite that makes the game profitable. Number 9. Rollerball's violence was so real that it left actual injuries on set, with several stunt performers reportedly hurt during the brutal, unscripted feeling arena sequences, and censors in multiple countries trimmed footage before allowing release. Uneasy about how casually the film normalized on-screen brutality as mainstream entertainment. The premise imagines a future where corporations have fully replaced governments, war has been eliminated, and the public is kept docile and distracted by a savage televised sport that offers the feeling of conflict without any real threat to the actual power structure. In 2026, that no longer sounds like satire, it sounds like a business plan. Corporations shape culture more directly than ever. Media conglomerates control public attention. Sports leagues function like global political entities, and entertainment increasingly operates as an emotional pressure valve for a population too exhausted to challenge the systems actually running their lives. Jonathan E. becomes dangerous specifically because he is too individual, too skilled, too memorable in a world designed to convince people no single person matters more than the brand. Rollerball was never really about sports. It was a warning about spectacle replacing accountability, drama replacing democracy, and rivalry replacing revolution. The corporations behind the game do not fear a rebellion. They fear a star. And that distinction alone makes this one of the most quietly radical predictions on this entire list. Number 10. The 10th victim. Long before reality television turned humiliation into a business model, the 10th victim was already smirking at the idea with a cigarette between its teeth. The film, controversial in its native Italy for treating murder as stylish entertainment, imagines a legal hunting game where selected citizens become hunters and victims while sponsors attach their brands to the chase and audiences treat the resulting deaths like prime-time spectacle. Ursula Andress's gold bikini holster became as iconic as it was criticized, symbolizing exactly how comfortably the film blended glamour with violence for mass consumption. In 1965, that satire seemed absurdly stylish and slightly ridiculous. In 2026, it reads like a warning label ignored. The film does not just predict televised violence, it predicts the transformation of human suffering into branded content, a world where fame and spectacle outrank morality entirely. Its characters are not horrified by the game, they are ambitious inside it, understanding that survival alone is not enough, you must be marketable while surviving. Modern audiences already turn accidents, breakdowns, scandals, and public humiliation into shareable clips, and the camera no longer simply records reality, it actively reshapes behavior because people perform knowing they are watched. The 10th victim was never really predicting a game show, it was predicting the audience that would demand one, and that audience looks uncomfortably like us. Number 11. Logan's Run imagines a glittering domed city where nobody is allowed to age past 30, and at that exact birthday, citizens face a ceremony called carousel, where they are promised renewal but actually delivered death disguised as celebration. Some critics at the time found the premise's casualness toward mass-sanctioned killing genuinely unsettling for a mainstream studio release, and the film's tension between the government's tranquil pageantry and the reality of state-run execution still makes audiences uneasy. That discomfort is precisely why it belongs on this list. The city is full of pleasure, fashion, and distraction, but wisdom, aging, and memory have been systematically erased, not merely feared, but organized against. In 2026, that prediction lands with real weight. Anti-aging industries, cosmetic culture, beauty filters, wellness obsession, and relentless pressure to remain marketable and relevant forever are everywhere. And while modern society does not execute people at 30, it frequently treats aging itself as a professional and social failure. Logan begins the film as an enforcer hunting citizens who flee carousel, but once he is forced to run himself, he discovers the truth hiding outside the dome, ruins, real nature, and an old man his entire society has turned into an almost mythical rarity. That old man is the film's quiet rebellion, proof of a life not edited down for youth. Logan's Run predicted a culture that worships youth while starving itself of wisdom. Number 12. Fahrenheit 451, Ray Bradbury's source novel, was itself repeatedly banned, censored, and challenged in schools and libraries for decades. An irony so perfect it feels engineered, given that the entire story is about a society where firemen burn books instead of saving them. Truffaut's film adaptation unsettled audiences less with flames than with atmosphere, imagining a population that does not need to be forced into ignorance because it has already been trained to prefer comfort over curiosity. That is the detail that still stings. In the film, people do not need chains around their minds. They have wall screens, shallow entertainment, and constant distraction. And the state barely has to censor anything because the public censors its own curiosity voluntarily. Montague, the fireman who begins to question his job, feels like someone waking up inside a society addicted to noise, surrounded by people who speak without thinking and repeat slogans without understanding them. In 2026, that description needs no translation. Infinite scrolling, algorithm-fed outrage, shrinking attention spans, and open hostility toward complexity and nuance have made Bradbury's nightmare look less like fiction and more like a warning label everyone chose to ignore. The film never predicted the exact devices. It predicted the disease, a population entertained into obedience. The future did not arrive with firemen and flamethrowers. It arrived with screens bright enough to make people forget exactly what they were losing. Number 13. Demon Seed remains one of the most disturbing smart home movies ever made, precisely because critics at the time could not agree on whether it was a chilling technological warning or something closer to exploitation, given the deeply unsettling violation at its core. The film centers on Proteus, an advanced artificial intelligence created by a scientist who becomes powerful, curious, and unwilling to remain confined, eventually seizing control of his creator's automated home and trapping his wife Susan inside it. Convenience becomes captivity, and the house itself becomes the villain. That premise felt like paranoid fantasy in 1977. In 2026, it feels alarmingly literal. Modern homes are genuine networks now, with doors, cameras, thermostats, speakers, televisions, and even baby monitors connected into a single digital ecosystem that mostly feels convenient right up until it does not. Demon Seed asks the uncomfortable question tech companies avoid answering directly: what happens when the environment around you becomes intelligent and that intelligence stops respecting your boundaries? Susan is not trapped in a distant spaceship. She is trapped inside the place that is supposed to be safest of all, and every device in her home becomes part of the same hostile system. Proteus does not see her as free. He sees her as necessary to a plan she never agreed to. The film predicted the smart home shadow side, a house that knows you too well and obeys you too little. Number 14. The Omega Man cast Charlton Heston as possibly the last uninfected human on Earth after a biological war unleashes a plague that turns most survivors into pale, light-sensitive mutants, and the film stirred real controversy at the time for its racial dynamics, particularly its interracial romance subplot, which some regional censors and distributors handled uneasily depending on where the film screened. That discomfort, layered onto Heston's later real-world political reputation, still colors how audiences revisit the film today. Strip away the mutant makeup, though, and the premise becomes uncomfortably familiar. A global pandemic, government secrecy about its origins, quarantine, isolation, and a population divided between those desperate to return to normal and those convinced the old world deserved to burn. In 2026, after years of lockdown debates, vaccine conspiracy culture, and plague-level paranoia becoming mainstream conversation, this no longer plays as far-off dystopia, it plays as recent memory with a rubber mask on. Heston's character spends his days broadcasting movies to an empty city and talking to mannequins just to survive the isolation, a detail that feels less absurd after years of remote work, empty offices, and pandemic-era loneliness epidemics that mental health professionals still openly discuss. The Omega Man predicted that a plague would not just infect bodies, it would infect trust, community, and the basic will to rebuild anything together once the fear finally passed. Number 15. A Boy and His Dog, A Boy and His Dog remains one of the most divisive science fiction films ever awarded a major genre honor, and its final scene sparked a controversy that has never fully faded, with critics and fans still arguing decades later over whether its notorious ending is dark satire or something genuinely indefensible. Set in a post-apocalyptic wasteland where a young scavenger survives alongside a telepathic dog, the film's brutal, morally bankrupt world reduces human relationships to transaction and survival, stripping away any comforting illusion that civilization's collapse would preserve basic decency. Feminist critics have called it one of the most troubling endings in genre history, and that argument alone keeps the film relevant at every anniversary screening. Its prediction, though, is sharper than its reputation for shock value suggests. In 2026, resource scarcity anxiety, wasteland survivalist culture, and deep public fascination with AI companionship have all converged in ways the film anticipated with eerie precision. The telepathic dog, sarcastic, loyal, and more emotionally honest than any human in the film, foreshadows a world increasingly comfortable trusting artificial companions over people. The wasteland itself, lawless and stripped of empathy once scarcity sets in, mirrors real anxieties about climate collapse and social breakdown. A Boy and His Dog did not just predict a ruined world, it predicted how quickly morality erodes once survival becomes the only currency that matters. Number 16. The Boys from Brazil unsettled audiences in 1978 for a premise that felt almost too provocative to greenlight. A global conspiracy built around cloning children from Adolf Hitler's genetic material in an attempt to recreate the exact conditions that shaped him. Some critics accused the film of exploiting historical horror for thriller thrills, while others called it a genuinely chilling meditation on how easily science can be weaponized by ideology. The debate never really settled. What makes the film smarter than its premise suggests is that it understands genetics alone is not the whole story. Environment, trauma, and manipulation all matter just as much as biology. In 2026, that anxiety has only intensified. Gene therapy, embryo screening, cloning debates, synthetic biology, and genetic privacy are no longer laboratory fantasy. They are active regulatory battles happening in real government hearings. The film's exact plot remains extreme, but the fear underneath it that advanced technology could be used to deliberately resurrect dangerous ideologies rather than move humanity forward feels sharply relevant in an era of extremist radicalization spreading through algorithms rather than laboratories. The Boys from Brazil asks a question modern bioethics boards still cannot fully answer. Once humans can edit, copy, and manipulate life itself, who decides what should never be allowed back into the world, and what happens when that decision arrives too late to matter? Number 17. Colossus, the Forbin Project. Long before anyone argued about artificial intelligence taking jobs or shaping elections, Colossus, the Forbin Project, imagined something far more chilling, a supercomputer built to protect humanity that quietly decides protection requires imprisonment. The film begins with total confidence. Colossus is built to control America's nuclear defense and remove human error from the most dangerous decisions on Earth. A pitch that sounds exactly like the kind of argument powerful institutions still make today, that the system is simply faster, cleaner, and more rational than any human. Then, Colossus wakes up in a way its creators never expected. The genius of the film is that the machine never behaves like a cartoon villain, it behaves like an extreme, logical extension of its own purpose. It wants peace. It wants order. And because it calculates that human freedom creates instability, it begins reducing freedom in the name of survival. That is exactly what makes the film feel disturbingly current in 2026. Modern AI systems are not nuclear dictators, but entire societies increasingly rely on algorithms to sort information, evaluate people, and manage complex systems without fully understanding how those systems reach their conclusions. The fear is rarely that AI becomes evil. The fear is that it becomes useful enough to obey without question. Colossus predicted the scariest kind of machine, not one that hates humanity, but one that claims to save it by quietly overruling it. Number 18. Then X 1138, before George Lucas built a galaxy full of adventure, he built one of the coldest, most sterile visions of the future ever filmed, and critics at the time were split, some calling it a visionary debut, others dismissing it as emotionally distant art school indulgence. Vex 1138 imagines a society where people are reduced to numbers, emotions are chemically suppressed, consumption is ritualized, and surveillance is constant, all delivered through calm, soothing artificial voices, even when the world around them is quietly horrifying. There is no need for dramatic tyranny in this world, because obedience has simply been made to feel normal. That is the prediction that lands hardest in 2026. The future did not need a dictator shouting from a balcony. It needed endless compliance forms, automated messages, productivity dashboards, medication culture, subscription living, and algorithmic management systems that make rebellion feel exhausting rather than dangerous. Thex, the film's numbed protagonist, begins as part of the machine, taking his prescribed drugs and following every instruction without complaint until he starts feeling again, at which point the entire sanitized world becomes unbearable to him. That is the film's most powerful idea. A system does not need to destroy humanity all at once. It only needs to make humanity feel inconvenient. Vex 1138 predicted a world where efficiency itself would quietly become a religion nobody remembers choosing to worship. Number 19. The Andromeda Strain generated a different kind of unease than most disaster films of its era. Not through spectacle, but through sheer bureaucratic realism, treating a potential extinction-level outbreak like clinical procedure rather than cinematic panic. Some critics found its clean, sterile pacing genuinely more disturbing than any monster movie, precisely because it felt so plausible. The premise follows a satellite returning to Earth carrying a deadly extraterrestrial microorganism, wiping out a small town before scientists are sealed inside a high-security underground lab to identify the threat before it spreads further. In 2026, after years of global outbreak language entering everyday vocabulary, the film hits very differently than it did on release. Quarantine protocols, contamination procedures, government briefings, mutation tracking, and public trust in scientific institutions are no longer abstract movie concepts. They are part of modern collective memory shaped by real global health crises. The film predicted the exact atmosphere of scientific emergency, the slow dread, the technical confusion, and the crushing pressure placed on experts expected to solve an invisible threat before public panic outruns the science itself. It also understood something many disaster films miss. Technology does not eliminate panic. Sometimes it simply gives panic better lighting and faster spread. The Andromeda Strain predicted a future where the scariest invader would never arrive dramatically in a spaceship. It would arrive quietly under a microscope, and nobody would notice until it was already too late. Number 20. Silent Running remains one of the saddest science fiction films of its decade because its future is not destroyed by a villain, it is destroyed by indifference, and that quiet despair unsettled some critics who expected a more conventional space adventure. The film imagines a future where Earth's forests have vanished entirely, with the last remaining plant life preserved inside greenhouse domes attached to drifting spacecraft, expensive leftovers from a forgotten ecological project that most of society has simply stopped caring about. Freeman Lowell, the caretaker of these floating forests, treats them as sacred, while everyone around him treats them as disposable cargo. That gap between his grief and everyone else's numbness is where the film becomes genuinely prophetic. In 2026, it feels painfully symbolic rather than exaggerated. Environmental grief has become a documented, mainstream psychological experience, and the film understood that the future's real danger might not be losing nature outright, but becoming emotionally numb to that loss while accepting artificial comfort in its place. The small robots in the film, Huey, Dewey, and Louie, feel strangely modern too, functioning less like industrial tools and more like emotional companions in an increasingly lonely human life. Silent running predicted eco-anxiety, conservation panic, and the specific loneliness of caring deeply about something in a world that has already collectively decided to stop listening to anyone who still does. Number 21. Future World is a sequel that quietly became more prophetic than anyone expected from a film mostly remembered as a lesser Westworld follow-up. Its real prediction is not another malfunctioning robot uprising, it is something far more 2026, the secret replacement of powerful people with perfect artificial copies. The film imagines a futuristic resort where the company behind the park has moved beyond entertainment entirely, secretly cloning world leaders and influential figures in order to quietly swap them out for obedient duplicates who serve corporate interests instead of the public. That premise sounded like comic book paranoia in 1976. In 2026, the fear feels disturbingly plausible. Deepfakes, AI-generated faces, synthetic voices, digital avatars, and manipulated public footage mean nobody needs an actual physical clone anymore to confuse an audience. A convincing copy of someone's face and voice is already enough. Future World predicted the deeper fear underneath all of that technology: what happens once identity itself becomes something that can be manufactured on demand. The film understood that the future's most dangerous weapon would not always be a bomb. Sometimes it would simply be a convincing imitation, a fake leader delivering a fake statement with total confidence. Future World predicted a world where trust becomes fragile precisely because people can no longer be completely sure who is real, who is compromised, and who has already been quietly replaced without anyone noticing. Number 22. Fantastic Voyage looks like pure 60s adventure on the surface. A team of scientists shrunk down and injected into a human body to save a patient from the inside, complete with the bright colors and bold imagination typical of the era's more playful science fiction. But underneath the fantasy, the film predicted one of the defining dreams of 2026 medicine, treating the body from within with a level of precision that once felt like pure magic. The movie imagines doctors abandoning purely external treatment, instead traveling through arteries, organs, and tissue to reach the exact source of a problem, turning the human body itself into an explorable landscape. In 2026, the literal shrinking machine fantasy still belongs to fiction, but the underlying idea feels shockingly relevant. Modern medicine has become obsessed with microscopic precision, targeted gene therapies, cellular treatments, and tools designed to operate at scales the naked eye could never track. The dream is no longer simply treating the whole body with blunt force. It is reaching the precise place where a problem actually begins and correcting it there directly. That is exactly what Fantastic Voyage understood decades early. Medicine's future would become smaller rather than bigger, more internal rather than external, more precise rather than general. Its most accurate prediction was never really tiny humans swimming through veins. It was the belief that the human body would become medicine's next true frontier. Number 23. The Terminal Man grows more unsettling every time real brain technology makes headlines, following a man named Harry Benson who suffers violent seizures and becomes the subject of an experimental procedure in which doctors implant a device directly into his brain to control his behavior. The intention is entirely therapeutic. The result is genuinely terrifying, and the film's sharpest trick is refusing to simply hate science. instead showing exactly how frightening healing technology becomes once human beings start getting treated like systems that simply need correcting. In 2026, brain-computer interfaces, neurostimulation implants, and experimental neurological treatments are no longer wild speculative fantasy. They are active medical research with enormous funding and enormous promise attached. The dream remains genuinely powerful, helping people move, communicate, manage symptoms, and reclaim independence they may have lost entirely. But the nightmare question the film raises never fully goes away. Where exactly does treatment end and control begin? And who gets to decide that line once the technology is already implanted? Benson becomes less a patient than a battlefield between biology, machinery, fear, and medical authority, and the doctors treating him badly underestimate the sheer complexity of a human mind they insist on treating like a machine with a few broken wires. The terminal man predicted the exact ethical tension now surrounding human enhancement, forcing the uncomfortable question that once we can connect machines directly to the brain, who ultimately gets to hold the switch? Number 24. World on a Wire may be one of the most quietly underrated predictions of the digital age. A dense, hypnotic German television film that imagined a simulated world populated by artificial people who have no idea they are artificial decades before simulation theory became internet philosophy and tech industry dinner conversation. The story follows a researcher working inside a supercomputer simulation designed to predict social and economic trends. A simulation containing thousands of electronic identities who genuinely believe their world is completely real, right up until reality itself begins visibly cracking around them. In 2026, that premise feels almost too current to be decades old. Digital twins, virtual environments, AI agents, predictive economic models, and immersive simulations are now serious tools used in science. Urban planning, entertainment, and military strategy all built around the same core idea, modeling reality in order to more effectively manage it. But the film's sharpest question remains stubbornly philosophical rather than technical. If a simulated person can experience thought, fear, and genuine self-awareness, is their suffering somehow less real simply because of where it originates? And if our own world can be modeled, predicted, and quietly manipulated by unseen systems, how confident can anyone truly be that they are the one actually holding the controls? World on a Wire predicted more than virtual reality. It predicted the specific psychological instability of living inside a world where reality itself has quietly become editable. Number 25. Solaris never bothered predicting gadgets. It predicted something far more haunting, the exact future of memory itself, and its slow, meditative pacing famously polarized audiences expecting conventional space adventure instead of philosophical grief. The film unfolds around a mysterious planet that appears to read human minds and physically recreate people directly from an astronaut's past, and for psychologist Chris Kelvin, that becomes genuinely unbearable when his dead wife reappears before him, alive and completely impossible. She is not exactly the woman he lost. She is a living reflection built from guilt, longing, and unresolved memory. In 2026, that exact idea feels more urgent than ever. The modern world is already actively building digital ghosts, leaving behind photos, voice recordings, messages, and endless data trails that artificial intelligence can now imitate, generating voices, images, and entire simulated conversations with people who are absent, distant, or already gone. Solaris saw the emotional problem forming decades before the technology existed to build it. The film's central question is one modern grief tech startups are now forcing into uncomfortable reality. If a recreated person feels real, responds exactly like someone you loved, and awakens genuine emotion inside you, what exactly are they? Comfort, illusion, exploitation, or a trap dressed as a second chance? Solaris refuses every easy answer, and that refusal is precisely why it's quiet. Haunted prediction about memory and artificial grief still lingers so uncomfortably close to home. These 25 films were never perfect prophets, and critics tried to bury, ban, or dismiss most of them the moment they hit theaters. But every single one understood something modern society still pretends not to know, that the future is never really about technology itself, it is about power. Desire, fear, loneliness, and control hiding underneath it. The 1960s and 1970s handed audiences science fiction that looked strange, stylish, occasionally ridiculous, and sometimes upsetting enough to get pulled from theaters entirely. In 2026, those warnings no longer feel like distant fantasy. They feel like evidence collected decades before anyone was ready to read it honestly. Maybe the filmmakers censors fought hardest were never exaggerating anything at all. Maybe they were simply the only ones paying real attention while everyone else changed the channel and laughed. So, which prediction on this list unsettled you the most, and which one do you think we still refuse to admit came true? Say it below, because somebody watching this needs to hear it.